In 1884, a group of men in Berlin sat around a table. None of them were African. Yet in just 3 months, they carved up an entire continent like a pie. And Africa has never been the same since. Before the mad dash to carve up Africa, the continent was far from the empty wilderness European powers later portrayed it to be. In the early 1800s, Africa was a land of thriving kingdoms, bustling trade networks, and deeply rooted cultural systems. The Ashanti Empire in West Africa controlled vast gold and kola nut trades. In the east, the Ethiopian highlands stood proud, their Christian heritage unbroken since antiquity. To the south, the Zulu kingdom under Shaka had risen as a military powerhouse, reshaping the balance of power. These were not forgotten lands. They were centers of innovation, trade, and diplomacy. At this time, Europe's presence in Africa was surprisingly limited. Most European activity remained confined to coastal enclaves, forts and ports that had once served the Atlantic slave trade, which by the early 19th century was beginning to decline. Instead of slave ships, trading posts now exchanged textiles, firearms, and manufactured goods for ivory, palm oil, and gold. But across the seas, change was brewing. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Europe, fueling an insatiable hunger for raw materials and new markets. Cotton for factories, palm oil for machines, rubber for industry, all of it was abundant in Africa. European eyes shifted from coastal trade to the vast interior. And soon, a continent of powerful kingdoms would be targeted for division, not partnership. In the late 19th century, one man set the fuse for the greatest land grab in history, King Leopold II of Belgium. On the surface, Leopold promised civilization, Christianity, and progress. But beneath the polished words, he had only one goal, to carve out a private empire in Africa. His eyes landed on the vast basin of the Congo River, a land rich in ivory, rubber, and minerals. With clever diplomacy, Leopold disguised his venture as a humanitarian project. He called it the International African Association, a name that sounded noble, but in reality, it was a front for his personal conquest. Once Leopold's ambitions became clear, panic spread across Europe. If one small country like Belgium could claim such a massive territory, what was stopping France, Britain, Germany, or even Italy from doing the same? Suddenly, Africa, a continent with its own ancient civilizations and thriving societies, was being viewed as a giant chessboard for European powers. From the coasts of West Africa, where the French marched inland from Senegal, to southern Africa, where Britain's settlers and mining companies expanded, and East Africa, where Germany and Italy made their first claims, the race was on. But there was a problem. Each power was moving blindly, planting flags and signing treaties with local rulers, without knowing what the others were doing. The result? Overlapping claims, rising tensions, and the very real possibility that Europe itself could plunge into war, not over Europe, but over Africa. The stage was set for chaos. And to prevent it, the great powers would soon gather in Berlin to draw lines on a map, a meeting that would decide the fate of millions of Africans without a single African voice in the room. By 1884, the race for Africa was spinning out of control. Rival claims threatened to spark war among Europe's most powerful nations. To prevent bloodshed in Europe, not in Africa, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called the world's leaders to Berlin. From November 1884 to February 1885, representatives of 14 European nations gathered in Bismarck's opulent halls. Britain, France, Portugal, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Italy, and others, every colonial power with ambition in Africa had a seat. Even the United States sent observers. But here was the shocking truth. Not a single African leader was invited. The very future of Africa would be drawn, debated, and decided without Africa at the table. The main goal wasn't Africa's well-being, it was Europe's stability. The question was brutally simple. How could Europe carve Africa without carving each other apart? The conference birthed a set of rules that would formalize the greatest land grab in history. The first, the principle of effective occupation. No longer could a nation simply place its flag on a map and claim a territory. To own land, it needed to demonstrate real control, soldiers, forts, or administrative structures. This rule gave license to military conquest and the forced building of colonial governments across the continent. The second, free trade along the Congo and Niger rivers. These rivers were Africa's arteries, the lifelines into its vast interior. By opening them, Europe secured highways for the extraction of ivory, rubber, palm oil, and gold, while Africans themselves were excluded from the benefits. And then came the most infamous decision, the recognition of King Leopold II's personal empire, the so-called Congo Free State. Nearly 80 times the size of Belgium, it was handed over not to a nation, but to a single man, a monarch whose hunger for wealth would unleash one of the darkest chapters in human history. On paper, the Berlin Conference promised order. In reality, it opened the floodgates. The conference gave Europe a blueprint to slice Africa like a cake, while silencing its people completely. What began in those winter halls would redraw the map of a continent and scar it forever. The ink was barely dry on the Berlin Conference agreements of 1884 to 1885 when the Great Land Grab began. In smoke-filled rooms of Europe, diplomats and monarchs who had never set foot on African soil arrogantly divided the continent like pieces of a chessboard. In less than 30 years, nearly 90% of Africa was carved up and placed under European flags. What had once been powerful kingdoms, thriving empires, and culturally distinct tribal lands were reduced to artificial lines drawn on maps in distant capitals. These lines were drawn with rulers, not with respect for Africa's people. Entire civilizations were dismantled overnight. Ancient trade routes that had connected the Sahara to the Indian Ocean were disrupted. Rivers that had sustained generations were seized for colonial companies. Ethnic groups, ancient cultures, and rival kingdoms were forced into unnatural unions. Communities that had lived harmoniously for centuries were suddenly labeled enemies, while others were broken apart and scattered across new colonies. Take Nigeria, a land of over 250 ethnic groups, the Hausa of the North, the Yoruba of the West, the Igbo of the East, and countless others were forced into one colony. Their cultural, linguistic, and religious differences were ignored, laying the groundwork for decades of internal struggle. Or Rwanda. European powers, first Germany and later Belgium, elevated the minority Tutsi over the Hutu majority, freezing fluid social identities into rigid categories. Colonial policies created a hierarchy where one group was favored with education and leadership roles, while the other was marginalized. This deliberate divide planted seeds of resentment that would erupt into genocide a century later. But the most painful truth was this: every border, every policy, every decision was made with profit in mind, not the people. Vast territories were reshaped not to serve Africa, but to funnel its resources outward. Gold, rubber, diamonds, cocoa, and ivory, the lifeblood of Africa, were extracted at an industrial scale to feed Europe's factories, armies, and markets. The so-called civilizing mission was in reality an economic conquest. Missionaries and officials spoke of bringing light to a dark continent, but behind the speeches stood soldiers, company agents, and exploiters. Roads and railways weren't built to connect African people, they were designed to move goods faster to the ports. Schools and churches didn't empower Africans, they taught obedience to colonial authority. This was not just a map being redrawn. It was the systematic dismantling of Africa's independence. A continent that had its own empires, scholars, warriors, and inventors was recast as a dependent frontier. And the consequences of these artificial borders, the conflicts, the inequalities, the exploitation, still haunt Africa to this day. When Europe carved Africa, the true price was not measured in gold, ivory, or rubber. It was measured in human lives. Villages were emptied. Men were torn from their homes, women dragged into servitude, and even children pressed into brutal, endless labor. Communities that had stood for centuries, with their own rhythms of farming, hunting, and storytelling, were uprooted overnight. The land itself was stolen, seized for foreign plantations and companies. Soil that once nourished generations was stripped bare, its bounty flowing outward, leaving hunger and despair behind. In the Congo Free State, under King Leopold II of Belgium, the nightmare reached a scale almost beyond imagination. To satisfy the insatiable demand for rubber, Leopold's agents unleashed terror. Soldiers raided villages, dragging families into the forests to collect sap until their hands bled. To enforce quotas, punishments were merciless. Whippings with the dreaded chikot, a whip made of dried hippopotamus hide that tore flesh like knives. And if a man failed to meet the quota, his hands, or the hands of his children, were severed and displayed as proof of punishment. Entire families were held hostage. Villages were burned to ash, and in this crucible of cruelty, millions perished. Some say as many as 10 million Congolese lives were extinguished in just a few decades. And it was not only the Congo. Across the continent, traditional kings and chiefs who once commanded respect and loyalty were reduced to shadows, forced to act as intermediaries of empire. Authority that had once flowed from ancestral traditions was replaced by orders stamped with foreign seals. The voices of Africa's elders, priests, and leaders were drowned out by colonial decrees. Culture itself was targeted. Languages that carried history, wisdom, and identity were silenced in schools that demanded European tongues. Sacred traditions were dismissed as pagan. Spiritual practices outlawed. Children grew up speaking not the words of their ancestors, but the language of their conquerors, their identities reshaped to fit a foreign order. Meanwhile, Africa's treasures poured across the seas. Ivory carved into piano keys and ornaments. Timber transformed into furniture for European parlors. Minerals and gold fed industrial machines, while rubber fueled the new age of bicycles, automobiles, and telegraphs. Europe's wealth soared on Africa's back, its cities gleaming, while African villages starved. What remained behind was devastation, a continent scarred by violence, its people bleeding under the weight of empire. The wealth of Africa was gone, but what was stolen could not be measured in resources alone. It was the lives lost, the cultures erased, the voices silenced. This was the human cost of empire, a debt that can never truly be repaid. The borders drawn in Berlin more than a century ago still define Africa today. But they were never designed to unite, only to divide. Lines carved by foreign hands forced rival groups together while splitting ancient kingdoms apart. The seeds of conflict were planted in ink on European maps. The effects went far beyond borders. Entire economies were restructured to serve Europe's hunger for profit. Roads, railways, and ports weren't built for Africa's growth, but for extraction. This disruption set back Africa's development for generations. And yet Africa endured. Nations have risen from those colonial lines, reshaping identity from imposed divisions. Still, the scars remain, a reminder that in Berlin, Africa was not divided for Africans, but despite them. But history's wounds are not destiny. The story of Africa is not only one of division and exploitation, it is also one of resilience, resistance, and rebirth. Today, as new generations reclaim their heritage and reimagine their future, the Berlin Conference stands not as the final word, but as a warning. A reminder that Africa's true power lies not in the borders drawn by others, but in the unity, creativity, and strength of its own people.